the family dinner where my father-in-law reminded everyone, again, who paid for their houses, he raised his glass and said, "This family stays together because I keep it together. Every roof over your heads, every car in your driveways, remember who made that possible. Loyalty isn't free." Everyone murmured their gratitude, heads down, and I set down my fork and said, "Actually, Gerald, I've been reading the loan agreements, and I think the family should know what you actually did. Let me back up. My name is Adiz Okoro. I'm 36 years old, and I married into a family that was ruled, not led, ruled, by a man who had figured out that the surest way to own people is to lend them money. My father-in-law didn't control his family with love or respect. He controlled them with debt, carefully constructed, deliberately inescapable, and disguised as generosity. And he'd done it so well for so long that no one in the family had realized they were living inside a cage until I read the paperwork holding the bars together. Let me tell you about Gerald. Gerald Okoro was a self-made man, and he never let anyone forget it. He'd built a successful contracting business from nothing, and by the time I entered the family, he was wealthy, and he had turned that wealth into a system of total control. His 3 adult children, my husband Emeka and his 2 siblings, were all in various ways financially dependent on Gerald. And the dependence was not accidental. Gerald had engineered it. Here's how it worked. Whenever one of his children reached a milestone, buying a house, starting a business, needing a car, facing an emergency, Gerald was there, generous, ready to help. But he never gave. He lent. Everything was a loan, structured through his business or through private agreements he drew up himself. My husband's house, my brother-in-law's business, my sister-in-law's car, and her children's school fees, all of it financed by Gerald, all of it debt. And Gerald used that debt like a leash. Every family gathering was an occasion for him to remind everyone who'd paid for what. Every disagreement was settled by the unspoken threat of the loans. If a child displeased him, married someone he didn't like, moved too far away, pushed back on his opinions, Gerald would grow cold and mention casually that the terms of a loan could always be reviewed. He never had to make the threat explicit. Everyone knew. The debt hung over every relationship like weather. The result was a family of adults who behaved like frightened children around their father. My husband, a grown man with a career, would go silent and small when Gerald spoke. My in-laws deferred to Gerald on everything: where to live, how to raise their kids, what opinions to hold, because Gerald could, at any moment, call in what they owed and destroy them. They called it respect. It was fear wearing respect's clothes. I saw it clearly because I came from outside. I'd grown up in a family that was poor but free, where love didn't come with an invoice, and I found the Okoro dynamic disturbing from the start. But I was new, and I was quiet about it, and I told myself it wasn't my place. My husband loved his father, or believed he did, in the complicated way you can love the person who controls you. I didn't want to be the outsider daughter-in-law who caused problems. Then Gerald came for me. It happened when Emeka and I wanted to make our own decision, a real one, an independent one. We wanted to move to another city for a career opportunity of mine, a genuine step up. And when we told Gerald, he did not congratulate us. He grew cold, and then he reminded Emeka in front of me that the loan on our house had terms, and that family that moves away sometimes finds those terms become inconvenient. He was threatening to call in our mortgage to financially destroy us because I'd gotten a job in another city. My independence was a threat to his control, and he moved to crush it casually over dinner. Emeka folded, right in front of me. My husband looked at his father and abandoned my opportunity and our independence, because 36 years of the leash had trained him to. And I understood in that moment that I had not married one man. I'd married a man and the debt that owned him, and until that debt was broken, I would never actually have a husband. I'd have a subsidiary of Gerald Okoro. So I made a decision. I was going to break the leash. Not just for us, for the whole family, if I could. But I was going to do it the way you break something built by a clever man, by understanding it better than he did. Here is what I did. First, I asked to see the paperwork. Ours to start. As Emeka's wife, I had every right to see the loan agreement on our own home, and when Emeka hesitated, because even letting me look felt like a betrayal of his father, I insisted, gently but immovably. And I read it. Carefully, all of it. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm meticulous, and I read every clause of the agreement Gerald had drawn up, and I found the first thread. Because Gerald, it turned out, had made a critical error born of arrogance. He drafted these agreements himself, or with minimal legal help, because he was certain no one would ever challenge him. And a man who drafts his own predatory loan agreements, certain of his own cleverness and certain no one will ever look closely, makes mistakes. Legal ones. The kind that matter. Our loan agreement, the one Gerald was using to threaten us, was, in several key respects, not enforceable the way he believed. The interest terms violated state lending laws. The agreement lacked disclosures that private loans of that size legally require. And crucially, Gerald had structured it in a way that, when I researched it, likely constituted an unlicensed lending operation. Because Gerald wasn't just informally helping family, he was running what amounted to a private lending business, across many loans for profit and control. Without any of the licenses or legal compliance that requires. The leash, it turned out, was made of paper, and the paper was flawed. Second, I went deeper, carefully. I couldn't demand to see the other family members' agreements. They weren't mine. But I could learn the structure, and I could understand what Gerald had built. And what I came to understand was that Gerald's whole system had a fatal vulnerability. It only worked as long as nobody looked at it legally. Threats were effective precisely because everyone assumed the debts were ironclad, and Gerald was untouchable. But if the loans were unenforceable or illegal, then the threats were empty, and worse, Gerald himself was exposed, because running an unlicensed, non-compliant lending operation carries real legal consequences for the lender. Gerald had spent 30 years pointing a gun at his family, and when I finally examined the gun, I realized it wasn't loaded, and that picking it up at all had been a crime. Third, I got a real expert. I took our loan agreement, just ours, which was mine to share, to a consumer finance attorney named Patricia N. Namdi, who specialized in exactly this kind of predatory lending. And Patricia read it and got the particular focused expression of a professional who has just seen something egregious. "This agreement," she said, "is unenforceable on multiple grounds, and the way it's structured, if he's done this repeatedly across many people for profit and control, your father-in-law has significant exposure. He hasn't been protecting this family. He's been committing a series of lending violations against it and threatening people with debts that a court would likely throw out. You're not trapped. You were never trapped. You just didn't know the door was unlocked. I had, in my hands, the key to the whole cage. But I want to tell you the hardest part, because it's the part that matters most. Knowing the leash was breakable didn't automatically free anyone, because the family didn't know. They still believed in the gun. And Gerald still ruled them with a threat that I now knew was empty, but they still thought was real. To free them, I had to show them all of them, at once, in a way Gerald couldn't spin. Now, the dinner. It was a typical Akoro gathering, which meant it was a monthly reminder of everyone's debts disguised as a family meal. And Gerald, as he always did, took his moment. He raised his glass and delivered his usual sermon. "This family stays together because I keep it together. Every roof over your heads. Remember who made it possible. Loyalty isn't free." And everyone murmured their gratitude, heads down, 30 years of trained deference. And I set down my fork. "Actually, Gerald," I said, "I've been reading the loan agreements, and I think the family should know what you actually did." The table went still. This did not happen. Nobody challenged Gerald. Emeka's hand found my arm under the table, a warning. I didn't stop. "Gerald says he's kept this family together," I said to the room. "What he's actually done is lend each of us money in a way designed to keep us afraid of him. Not help, control. And I know that because I finally read our loan agreement, the one he threatened to call in last month because Emeka and I wanted to move for my job." Gerald's face darkened. "You have no idea what you're—" "I took it to a lending attorney," I continued steadily. "Our agreement is unenforceable. The interest violates state law. It's missing required disclosures. And the way you've run these loans, many of them, across all of us, for years, for profit and for control, likely constitutes an unlicensed lending operation. Which means, Gerald, that the debts you've been threatening everyone with are, in all likelihood, uncollectible. The gun you've been pointing at this family for 30 years isn't loaded, and pointing it at all may have been illegal." The silence was total. I turned to the family, to my husband, my in-laws, all of them frozen. "He's been telling you that you owe him. That you're not free. That loyalty means obedience because he holds your debts. But a debt a court won't enforce isn't a leash. It's a bluff. Every one of you has been living in fear of a threat that doesn't hold up. Patricia, the attorney, will look at any of your agreements. I brought her card for everyone. I set a small stack of business cards in the middle of the table, next to the serving dishes. You don't have to be afraid of him anymore." "You never actually did. You just didn't check. Here is how it ended, and this one ended in liberation, which is its own kind of triumph. Gerald did what cornered controllers do. He raged. He threatened. He tried to reassert the dominance that had worked for 30 years. But the threats had lost their power the instant everyone understood they were empty, and you cannot rule by fear once the fear is gone. One by one, not all at once, it took time. Courage is slow. His children took Patricia's card. And one by one, they had their agreements reviewed, and one by one, they learned the same truth. The debts were largely unenforceable, and Gerald had far more to fear from them, legally, than they had from him. The whole structure collapsed. Not into a lawsuit. Nobody wanted to destroy Gerald. They just wanted to be free of him, but into a renegotiation of everything. The family, newly aware that the loans couldn't be weaponized, was finally able to deal with Gerald as adults instead of hostages. Some of the debts were formally forgiven, because Gerald, once he understood his own legal exposure, was suddenly very motivated to make problems disappear. Some were restructured into something fair and clean. And the leash, the thing that had made a family of grown adults behave like frightened children, was gone. My husband was the most changed. Watching Emeka realize that the fear he'd carried his whole life was based on a bluff was like watching a man set down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of his body. He stood up to his father for the first time in his life, not cruelly, but finally as an equal. And he apologized to me for the night he'd folded for choosing his father's leash over my opportunity. "I didn't know I could say no," he said. "I genuinely didn't know it was allowed. That's what 30 years of debt control does to a person. It doesn't just take your money, it takes your belief that no is a word you're allowed to use. We took the job. We moved." Gerald's threats about the mortgage evaporated, because they'd always been empty, and now everyone knew it. My career took the step up it had been denied. And the family, freed from the cage, actually became closer. Because it turns out that people love each other more easily when they're not afraid of each other, when love doesn't come with an invoice and a threat. Gerald is diminished now, a patriarch who ruled through fear and lost his only weapon. Some of his children have relationships with him still, cooler and more honest ones. He never apologized, never understood that what he called keeping the family together was actually holding it hostage. And like Gerald rarely do, but he can't hurt anyone anymore, and that's enough. For 30 years, my father-in-law told this family that he owned us because he held our debts and loyalty wasn't free. He was half right. Loyalty isn't free, but it can't be bought with a loan. It can't be enforced with a threat. And the moment I read the fine print, he was so sure no one would ever check, we all found out that the man who claimed to own us had never actually held anything but our fear. And fear, it turns out, is the one debt you can discharge the instant you stop agreeing to owe it.